This book is the Bible for anyone who wants to understand the blessings and curses of growing up multiculturally. This book is widely acclaimed as the first and only book to fully examine the legacy of transition and change shared by those who have grown up globally. If you're familiar with the term third culture kid or TCK, you or someone you know has almost definitely either been given a copy of this book or at least been told to read it. And yet, they probably never did, and that's not good. Here's why. Before the first edition of Third Culture Kids was published in 1999, almost every resource available to parents, teachers, and caregivers of TCKs dismissed any concerns about the potential harm this kind of upbringing could bring to their children's development and well-being in adulthood. It was very common to claim that children are flexible, they bounce back easily, and there's no need to worry about them. Early on, the term Third Culture Kid was most commonly used in North American missionary spaces. This made it very hard to raise awareness of any negatives that could come with the TCK upbringing, as it was seen as potentially interfering with God's work to acknowledge issues present in how missionary organizations approached caring for the needs of kids being raised abroad. Even as a TCK in the 2000s and 2010s, this was a very common rhetoric that I heard constantly. Whenever I would complain about any of the hardships I was going through, people would say, most adult TCKs are thankful for growing up internationally. You will be too. And that was always the end of discussion. No matter how hard things got, I needed to be nothing but thankful to my family and their organization for giving me the opportunity to grow up internationally. As an adult now looking back, I am grateful, but I also carry so much pain with me. Third Culture Kids addresses this dismissive attitude towards TCK's needs. Through hundreds of interviews, David Pollock and Ruth Van Recken found common traits and challenges that TCKs share, seeing how their unstable upbringings affect them in adulthood. The first half of the book is full of definitions and theory, while the second half gives suggestions on how caregivers and TCKs themselves can mitigate the challenges that often appear in adulthood. Pros and cons. Third Culture Kids has had a profound impact on adult TCKs and institutions. One look at Goodreads will show you just how life-changing this book has been on so many adults who for the first time through this book have had their lifelong pain acknowledged and validated. It is one of, if not the #1 resource for people who work with TCKs. My dad had to go to an entire seminar in the 2000s on this book for his international teaching job, and my sister, who just got a job in 2025 at a different international school on another continent, was also given a copy of this book as part of her required reading. I was passively aware of this book growing up, but I didn't know anyone who actually read it, or if they had, nobody who cared enough to talk about it. So I never thought that there was actually anything worth written inside. Now that I have read it myself, I see just how meaningful so many of its author's ideas are, but I also see why so many people don't read it. Simply put, it's not very well written. It's inconsistent and repetitive and includes lots and lots of fluff. This Goodreads review sums it up pretty well. Good, but 25% of this book could have been taken off. The third edition is written by 3 authors who all have very distinct voices that sometimes don't really agree with each other. This gets really confusing, especially when defining things such as what exactly a TCK is and who exactly the subject group of David Pollock and Ruth Van Recken's research was. I encourage anyone who is reading Third Culture Kids to read the history section in Appendix 2 of the 3rd edition. It might also be in previous editions, but I wouldn't know. I only read the 3rd one. After finishing the book my first way through, I thought I understood it all, mostly, but when I read the history appendix, I felt like a lot of my confusion was cleared. Understanding the history of TCK research and the coining of terms helped a lot with navigating the 3 conflicting authors' voices. One thing that I continue to find challenging is deciphering which ideas are based on reliable academic research and which ideas are creative yet not necessarily reliable opinions of the authors. There are many religious and cultural biases of the authors that appear, so it's important not to take everything written as fact. The main ideas from chapters 1 and 2. Definitions. A third culture kid is a person who spends a significant part of his or her first 18 years of life accompanying parents into a country or countries that are different from at least one of the parents' passport countries due to a parent's choice of work or advanced training. The 4 traditional TCK categories are military brats, missionary kids, foreign service dependents, and international business kids. This is the official definition. The book also claims that this is the definition it recognizes and uses. So, riddle me this. Why then do we spend almost the entirety of chapter 2 going over David Pollock's personal definition and only mentioning said official definition at the very end like an afterthought? David Pollock wanted to help everyone. His research was originally made with the traditional TCK categories in mind, even though they weren't called that at the time. But after years of holding TCK seminars where he would talk about his findings, he found that there were many people who related to parts of the TCK profile who did not fully fit into the definition. He wanted to make these people feel included, thus broadening his own definition to fit them all. This is what he ended up with. A third culture kid, or TCK, is a person who has spent a significant part of his or her developmental years outside of the parent's culture. As you can tell, this is a much broader definition than the official one, and I understand how broad definitions like this make meaningful research hard to do. So what is the third culture? Today, the third culture is thought to be formed from the collision between a first culture and a second culture. The first culture is known as the home or passport country of the TCK's parents. The second culture is the host cultures that the child has lived in. The third culture is a unique way of life that does not resemble the first or second culture, or even a mixture of the two. It is a completely unique culture that TCKs are seen to have formed regardless of where their first or second cultures are from. It's a culture that is shared by other TCKs who were brought up in similar cultural collision environments. The book likes to say that TCKs are raised in a neither nor world. It is neither fully the world of their parents, nor fully the world of the cultures they themselves have lived in. Who has spent a significant part? How much time does a child need to spend abroad to be considered a TCK? The age of a child can greatly affect the impact that 1 year abroad will have on them. A 3-year-old will have a vastly different experience spending a year abroad than a 12-year-old who is in the middle of learning how the world works and where they fit into the social structures around them. They may suddenly be in school in a foreign language or homeschooled for the first time, away from their already established relationships at home. They're going to be actively building new relationships over the course of this year, all of which they will ultimately have to leave again when the year is over. The 3-year-old will still experience the change in stability, language, food, and familiar faces, but it will not be as impactful on their identity as the 12-year-old. Although there is no exact time frame, 1 school year is usually enough to be considered long enough to have had an impact during the child's developmental years. This can, however, also be affected by the parents' or sending institutions' attitude towards the host country and how much effort they put into experiencing the culture and living like the locals. For example, living 6 months on the Ramstein military base without ever leaving the compound while continuing education in a US curriculum and having all of the grocery stores and restaurants around you imported from the United States will not have as big of an international impact as 6 months living off-grid in the villages of Kenya. Ultimately, it's up to the individual person to decide if they identify as a TCK. Nobody can tell someone how much of an impact an experience had on them except themselves. Of his or her developmental years. Why is it so important to recognize these children's experiences and give them space separate from the experiences of adults who move abroad for the first time in adulthood? That's because, unlike adults, children are living in these cross-cultural worlds at the same time as they are finding their identity, building relationships for the first time, identifying their place in the social hierarchy, and developing their perspective of the world. Adults who move abroad for the first time in adulthood still face challenges, but they are very different from the ones that come from a high-mobility childhood. That is also why even after TCKs grow up, they often still refer to themselves as TCKs, or third culture kids. Their experience specifically had to do with the effects that living internationally had on them as a developing child. 4 common factors. Here is what David Pollock and Ruth Van Recken claim are the 4 shared universals of a traditional TCK experience that shape TCKs' lives in a way that transcends their family, ethnic, national, and sector background. 1. Expected repatriation. 2. Distinct differences. 3. Privileged lifestyle. 4. System identity. Let's start with number 1. Expected repatriation. Unlike immigrants, TCKs rarely move abroad permanently. Their parents usually proudly call themselves expatriates or expats, since at the time of deployment, there's an expectation they aren't going to take steps to settle permanently in the host country. Even if the parents are still living abroad by the time their TCK children graduate high school, the children are usually expected to return or repatriate alone to their parents' country for university, since they do not consider themselves immigrants. Even if the TCK plans to return abroad later in life, the repatriation is an expected in-between step to repatriatize them to their passport country first before letting them out again. This is a mindset I have especially seen in my South Korean and US TCK peers. There is such strong patriotism expected from them, even forced upon them in some cases, like South Korea mandatory military service, before they are allowed to return abroad. This expectation to return to the parents' country before they even leave it for the first time changes many things in families' decisions that affect their children's future options. For example, their choice in education and how much effort they put into learning the local languages. I was born and raised in Germany. After graduating from high school in Germany, I did not return to the US or Canada, which was a very hard decision for me to make simply because my options were extremely limited in Europe. This is because I never learned German fluently. My parents had the expectation that they and all of us kids would return to Canada at some point, so learning German was never a priority. There's nothing else in my life that I have more shame for than not being fluent in German, despite being born there and living there for all 18 years of my childhood. If I could give one piece of advice for TCKs and their parents, it would be to prioritize TCKs learning the local language. Foreign languages are much harder to learn as an adult, so any languages children are able to pick up and keep up will benefit them for their entire lives. It is a lot of work though, which is why most TCKs don't learn the local languages, since their parents don't plan for them to stay long enough for it to pay off. There's a rise, however, in families who never fully repatriate. The book makes this number seem much larger than it really is, though. There is a small number of expats who, after years and years abroad in a few countries or just one, finally decide to settle down permanently as immigrants. The book uses the term unintended immigrants to describe them, but I think that might be coming from a bit of a US perspective that immigrants is a dirty word, so they add the unintended prefix so they can say immigrant? Oh no, not me. I'm an unintended immigrant. I didn't come here to be an immigrant. My parents are actually in the process of doing just that. They are the only expats I know who are doing that. It is not common and quite often discouraged by sending organizations. When I was a kid, it never crossed my mind that staying in Germany permanently and becoming immigrants was an option. If my parents had made the decision when my siblings and I were younger, we could have all become German citizens together. But my parents didn't know anyone that had done this, and they would have to switch organizations when they did or find local non-missionary jobs. So they waited until all of us kids had moved out to commit to it. If it was a more widely advertised option, I think there are many expat families who would do the same, which is probably exactly why it isn't advertised. Organizations don't want to lose their personnel. Even when parents and family members return to their home country, there are cases where the TCK themselves choose instead to stay abroad on their own accord. Many TCKs would choose to stay abroad rather than repatriate because they have a deeper connection to their host countries, cultures, and people. The book describes this phenomenon as unexpected, but I think it is very, very expected. The issue is that until the past decade or two, staying abroad to work or study was really challenging and expensive. Today, however, staying abroad might often end up being cheaper than repatriating and offer higher quality education and work opportunities. The number of TCKs who are finally able to do so is increasing, but it is still a very small number. So many TCKs I grew up with would have preferred to stay abroad, but the combination of family and cultural pressures, along with the consequences of parents' decisions not to educate their children at the local standard or learn the language to a level that would be accepted in universities or the job market, make it feel impossible to escape repatriation. My 3 older siblings all wanted to stay in Germany, or at least stay somewhere in Europe, but they ultimately decided to follow the cultural expectation and repatriate to North America. I saw how unhappy they were there and decided that I would do whatever it took to remain in Europe. Out of everyone in my graduating class, I was the only one with a European university next to my name on the pamphlet. I had never been to Lithuania, didn't know anyone there, and didn't even know where it was on a map until I had already been accepted to a university. I ended up living in Lithuania Lithuania for 4 years, completed my degree, and now live happily in Austria with my Austrian husband, still with no plans to ever return to North America. So many TCK peers of mine from high school have told me how jealous they are of me staying in Europe, and it makes me really sad because they could have done the same thing as me, but they were pressured so heavily by their family and community to repatriate that it never felt like a real plausible option for them to pursue. The book tries to argue that cultural expectation to repatriate is not as strong as it used to be, but I strongly disagree. It is not the expectation that is less, it is the options available to TCKs to go against the expectation that has increased. So repatriation is still a very present pressure on today's TCKs. Now onto factor number 2, distinct differences. There's a larger portion of TCKs today than 100 years ago who are raised in a country where they physically blend in with the locals and don't stand out immediately as foreigners. For example, a white Australian living in Poland, or an Indonesian living in Mongolia. Many countries today are no longer made up of a single homogeneous ethnic group. For example, a Nigerian living in France or a South Korean living in Canada. Although they are not members of the majority ethnic group in these countries, there's been enough migration over the past century for them not to stand immediately out of place as foreigners. This allows TCKs to blend in easier in a wider variety of countries today than they could have 100 years ago. The book uses this argument to state that the idea of distinct differences is no longer a key factor of the TCK lifestyle. Again, I strongly disagree. Even though these TCKs resemble locals of their host country, they still carry differences with them that will expose them as foreigners. Due to the expat mentality of not staying in a host country long term, it's rare to find a TCK who is actually encouraged or given the opportunity to learn the local social codes and languages fluently, even if they lived in the same host country most of their lives. This means, even if they blend in well physically, as soon as they speak or engage socially with locals in any kind of intimate setting, they are immediately ousted as foreigners. Beyond race, there are always local cultural and social codes that make the TCK stand out as different and not from here in a host country that they have not fully assimilated to. For example, whether or not they wait at a red light, how dressed up they want to be when in public, how they address strangers, their relationship with the government, police, and other forms of authority, even the level of independence they expect to have at different ages. Another example is this TikTok. It's a woman asking how European baristas know that she's from the US before she even says anything to them. The comments are full of different people pointing out things that stand out to them as non-European mannerisms, from her makeup style and fashion choices to the way she stands and how her face muscles look when she smiles. This goes so deep that even when a TCK returns to visit their parents' country, they are often perceived as foreigners there too by their own countrymen. An argument that people have made against previous editions of this book is that distinct differences is not a relevant TCK factor in today's world because social media has dissolved all cultural differences. Now, if you're like me and studied anything related to social sciences, international relations, communication, culture, media, let's all take a deep breath. Because the idea that social media has dissolved cultural differences in the world for today's youth is so unfounded and simply not true. Social media is not a mirror to reality. It's a heavily edited, censored, and exaggerated narrative parallel to the parts of reality that look good on screen. Beyond giving some helpful tips and tricks for people's initial move to a new place, social media cannot teach a viewer the vast nuances of the society they are about to move to. In fact, the book cites stories from people they've interviewed who said relying on social media to teach them about the culture they were moving to ended up having more negative effects on their move than if they had gone in completely blind. This is because they thought they understood everything before they moved. They overestimated what they had learned from social media, which meant they ended up engaging less with sources and people outside of social media with real experiences and personal advice about living in those places. The social media information they got ultimately set them back. Privileged lifestyle. Employees of international businesses, members of religious missions, the military and diplomatic corps are part of an elite community who are granted special privileges by their sponsoring organizations or host country. The military can use commissionary or PX, embassy families may employ domestic help and chauffeurs, and missionaries and business people are often provided housing that would cost a fortune to locals in the host country, but pennies in comparison to their international income or support. The ability to travel and live internationally is a privilege in itself, especially when paid for by sponsors. If you're chosen for one of these roles, it's a safe bet that you hold some level of privilege. For example, if you were sent abroad as a businessman, you were probably well educated, which is a privilege most people in the world can't afford. If you're a diplomat, you have social status, and it's important to note that even if they are poorer than the average diplomats in their host country, they're rarely going to be considered poor in their home country. Privilege is a huge aspect of the TCK profile that is important to acknowledge when understanding these kids' experiences. The final of the 4 TCK factors is system identity. Ruth Usim, the original TCK researcher who coined the term, believed that many TCK characteristics stem directly from strong identity ties to their parents' sponsoring organizations. Their actions in the host country reflect back onto their parents' work and the organization that sent them, meaning the choices made by TCKs on the field will be influenced by the attitudes encouraged by their parents' organization. The conscious change in attitude as a 24/7 representative of an organization affects the TCK's personality and identity development. Chapters 1 and 2 only introduce this concept without going into too much detail, but it's an important subject that will have more in-depth coverage in later chapters. Now, these were the main topics of chapters 1 and 2, but scattered throughout these chapters are many references to the idea of TCK visibility. At this point in the book, the authors spend a lot of time raving about the increase of TCK visibility in the world, as if they no longer experience the struggles of being misunderstood and mislabeled by society as of 2017, when this 3rd edition was published, which is just not true. And a bit odd, because later in the book, they do a total 180 and address TCKs being hidden immigrants and social chameleons who struggle to find their place in a society where nobody understands them. But global TCK visibility is not the TCK visibility that is most important. The visibility that needs urgent cultivation, the most important visibility that TCKs need more of right now, is in their own homes and classrooms. While going over the definition for a TCK in chapter 2, the authors isolate the words, is a person. What they say here is very relevant to the topic of TCK visibility. Rather than gushing about how visible TCKs are today compared to 30 years ago, they acknowledge just how invisible they really are. This often leads to unintentional neglect of TCK needs within their own communities. TCK's human needs are often disregarded by sending organizations, educators, parents, and even TCKs themselves. The authors notice that often, parents of TCKs will question whether the hurdles that come with the TCK profile are accurate, especially while their child is still young or living abroad. They claim that this experience is only positive, and all they see from their children is growth and opportunities to explore the world in a wonderful way. And the authors agree that it is a terrific experience, but it becomes a challenge when parents completely disregard the warnings. I was diagnosed with PTSD as an adult. I tried to advocate for myself as a teen, but even when I would tell educators and counselors in the community that I was struggling and something was wrong, they never once thought that I might need professional external help. Anxiety can be healed with prayer and grateful thinking, was the only help I ever got. TCKs are told that they aren't meant to complain. They are meant to be grateful because they are privileged, unique, and have a duty to uphold their organization's reputation, whether that's the military, their religion, or their country. It's common for parents to say that back in the past, these challenges may have been prevalent, but today they just aren't. Their children are just fine. And unfortunately, it's not only parents expressing this sentiment, but also educators who see their TCK students thriving day to day. Sending organizations encourage their parents and educators to think this way. These large organizations have actively claimed that what is said in this book is false or irrelevant in today's world. This mentality unfortunately makes parents unprepared when the children begin to show signs of struggling with common TCK challenges as they get older. It's in adulthood or after repatriating that most of these struggles come out. It's easier for TCKs to keep their internal conflicts hidden as young children, especially in the moment when all of these experiences are actively happening around them. Young children don't understand the complex feelings that they are having, especially when it seems their parents and educators haven't experienced the same thing. They don't have the vocabulary to express the paradoxical feelings going on inside of them, so it goes unnoticed. It's confusing for a kid to be excited to fly back to their grandparents, cousins, and family dog they had to leave behind years ago, but at the same time feeling deep sadness about the home and friends they love who they are leaving and will probably never see again. Educators often overlook the fact that TCKs often function the best at school because their international school is home, more so than their host country or home country. They may thrive in the school with their friends and familiar halls, community, culture, rules, and expectations that they understand. It's once the child leaves that space that many struggles appear in them seemingly out of nowhere. It's not really out of nowhere though, and the signs are visible if parents and educators know what it is to be mindful of. Someone who understands what is happening and what the language is to describe it all can have a much easier time noticing the signs of the TCK developing these characteristics in the moment, when even the TCK themselves might not be fully aware of it. There are many excuses organizations can make to reassure parents and educators that they don't need to worry about any of this. Religious organizations may claim that God is taking care of his missionaries and their children, so we don't need to put all this effort into MK and TCK advocacy. Diplomat kids may be given the best quality service and living conditions that are available to them, so people may claim that there's no reason to fuss over any needs being unmet. They live better than most kids. Ultimately, taking care of children's complex mental and physical needs takes time, energy, and resources. That means higher expenses for organizations that send families abroad. It's much easier to tell parents there's nothing to worry about. Is a person is sadly something that is forgotten, but TCKs young and old are people, many of whom had neglected needs as young children that they now carry with them with no support. Before trying to increase TCK visibility in the general public, we first need to increase TCK visibility within their own homes and organizations.